Power Blade, released in 1991 by Taito for the Nintendo Entertainment System and developed by Natsume. You know, those folks who made Scat. Cause that's funny. For some people at least. Power Blade is essentially a reworking or reimagining of a 1990 Famicom release called Power Blazer, which featured a Mega Man-esque character running through levels tossing boomerangs at enemies. One could easily assume that this is a mere hatchet job with minor tweaks similar to how Nintendo took Doki Doki Panic and turned it into Super Mario Bros. 2 with some graphical and minor gameplay changes, but that's not necessarily the case here. Power Blade isn't just a reskinned Power Blazer. It practically guts the original game with a major overhaul to the point where it almost feels like a different and arguably far better game than what came before. And yes, I did play the original Power Blazer. The differences are night and day, and that's about as far as I'll go with that game. Let's stick with the superior title. Power Blazer, released in 1990 by Taito for the Nintendo Family Computer and developed by Natsume. You know, those folks who made Final Mission. Which isn't as funny as Scat, but whatever. Anyway, Power Blazer places you in the role of Steve Trevor, short, stubby robot dude who fights robots and stuff. You know, like that one game there. The game starts off with a stage select screen. You know, like that one game there. There's no specific order to go through that will give you any advantage or anything. There's no weapons or upgrades to acquire in beating these levels. You pick your stages, you beat them bit by bit, and eventually challenge the final level once the initial 6 are cleared. Each stage is straightforward, reach the end of the level, pick up some power-ups along the way, whether they be reserve energy tanks and bombs or upgrades to your main attack, beat the boss to clear the level, and get a password to resume your progress. Pretty simple fare for the most part. Unfortunately, Steve Trevor is no Nova, the protagonist of the aforementioned Power Blade, which I will remind people is a drastically retooled Power Blazer for the overseas markets, which turned out to be the superior title due to various improvements made to the gameplay. So what makes Power Blazer the lesser title than the localized version that everyone else got? Well, it starts with old Steve here. In addition to adopting a short stubby form much like that blue guy there, he also lacks in the versatility department. Your main weapon is a boomerang, but you can only toss it left or right, and only so long as you're not climbing any ladders. The boomerang in its default form covers a pitiful distance, and returns to you whenever it hits an enemy. There are power-ups such as G blocks that will increase the range of your attack, and P blocks that will turn your boomerang red, and grant it the ability to hit multiple foes on a single toss. An ability, by the way, that is a default trait with Nova's Power Blade. Also, poor Steve only has one boomerang from beginning to end, with no opportunity to gain more to shoot in order to have more of a fighting chance. And sometimes there's also the dreaded end block that turns your boomerang back to its pathetic blue form. Needless to say, this is one to avoid at all costs. If you lose a life, your abilities get downgraded a bit, and if you lose all your lives, your game ends. On the one hand, you have unlimited continues and a straightforward password system to help you fight another day. On the other hand, though, using these options resets Steve back to basics, and item drops in Power Blazer are few and far between. Back to basics is not where you want to be when most of the enemies you fight are tanks that take multiple hits to die, and your hero never feels properly equipped to tackle these foes. Even when you're fully powered, such as it is, you never feel like you have much of a fighting chance, which is where those energy tanks and bombs come into play, which the password also doesn't save. Oops. Now there is a cheat that lets you start the game with a fully powered boomerang, which alleviates some of the pain if you want to go that route. And again, even in that state, it's not much. But the problems with Power Blazer goes beyond the limited nature of your main attack. Steve moves like a sloth and his jumps are pathetically weak, making even some of the simplest platforming bits a calculated risk, much less anything that involves precision jumping, moving platforms, or the classic disappearing blocks. An annoying gimmick to any competent hero, but an absolute nightmare to one that is less so. To put it another way, when your main hero has trouble just trying to grab onto a ladder because he's not overlapping that sweet spot to register such an action, yeah, fuck that noise, I'm going back to Power Blade, that game plays way the fuck better overall. The inadequacy of your hero and his inability to properly tackle the challenge that lays before you is the only real flaw of Power Blazer, and sadly it's the biggest one. Even control isn't quite up to snuff, as it tends to not respond to inputs every so often, particularly in regards to jumping during precarious situations. Notably, if you're leaping across a pit and you press up on the D-pad while in the air, all forward momentum is halted and you're sent crashing into the abyss below, which is kind of embarrassing. The thing is, if you replace Steve with Nova from Power Blade, or hell, replace him with a proper Rockman type hero that controlled well, you've got grounds for a relatively solid action platform game. I'm not going to fault level design too much because that's fine for straightforward linear stuff. Difficulty hits the sweet spot of firm but fair in the best of times, and the boss battles are kind of fun. You just needed a good controlling hero with a sliver of a chance, and that's not what you got here. The graphics in Power Blazer are crisp, bright, detailed, and clean. The character designs range from typically stubby anime-ish fare to somewhat less anime-ish fare. The levels themselves are rather nice looking with quite a bit of variety to it, whether it be slime-infested tunnels, the army base with the tanks, or the sewers. There is, of course, the dreaded flicker that takes place when lots of stuff is going on, but by that same token, that's perhaps the worst you'll get out of Power Blazer, with very few instances of slowdown here and there. Power Blazer also sports some great sound. Sound effects are as clean and as effective as you could get on the NES, or Famicom in this case, with none of them dipping into the dreaded white noise territory. The soundtrack is a superb collection of top-notch, catchy chiptunes, fitting in with the various levels you'll be traveling through, with some musical pieces almost sounding like something that would fit in nicely in a Castlevania game, which isn't a coincidence because Power Blade's music was composed by the same person that composed the original Castlevania music from 1986. I believe that her name is James Banana or something. I don't know. Probably should have been. Overall, Power Blazer is a generally bad game that served as a basis for a far better game in Power Blade. And really, it all boils down to a protagonist who is ill-equipped to deal with the obstacles that the game throws his way, whether it be poor platforming abilities or just lackluster attack options. In all fairness, Power Blazer is still largely playable, but playing this version only made me appreciate Power Blade even more. Because while the added abilities might have made that game somewhat easier, it also made it more fun to play because a fully powered Nova cutting through the competition felt satisfying, well-earned, and significant. A feeling that I never got with Power Blazer's main character, even at his so-called strongest. People often say that the Japanese version of a video game is far superior to the eventual localized iteration, but Power Blazer proves the exception to this rule. Skip this one and stick with Power Blade. It is simply the much better game.